episode of Vancouver Real. My name is Andy Zaremba, and with me behind the helm today is my brother Mike.
Hey everybody, nice to be here, and I'm excited for today's episode. It's been a long time coming.
Definitely excited, and as usual, we're recording out of 70 West Good River Street here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, and we're recording out of our business, Float House. And if you have no idea what Float House is, you can visit floathouse.ca and learn all about flotation therapy. And, well, our guest was actually potentially going to jump in the tank today, but, I'm telling you, we don't have availability at the moment. But, yeah, if you want to learn more about flotation therapy and the benefits, there's a really good short video on YouTube called What is Floating? If you just type that into YouTube, you'll find it, and it'll give you a good synopsis of all the benefits that flotation therapy offers. And if you'd like to get a discount, you can use the promo code VancouverReal, and that will get you 20% off a single float.
Fantastic. Yeah. And we'll make one more quick announcement for... My mic sounds a little off. I'm going to adjust this here. Hello. There we go. For the company Bennett's Choice and Brain Evolve, yes. He just released his newest product called Brain Beast. And it's a great name, by the way. And by the time you hear this, it'll be available at Float House, both locations in Vancouver. And basically, it's the complementary daytime formula of his Brain Evolve product, which is the nighttime formula, and Brain Beast is kind of like a nootropic designed to basically be on a similar level as, say, Alpha Brain. But it's his own unique patented formula, and I definitely encourage you all to give it a shot because Brain Evolve has just been really taken off here anyways on our shelves, and I think Brain Beast will be
the nighttime product I use pretty much every night, and it's amazing. I just fall right asleep and like...
I use it as well. I really like Brain Evolve, yeah.
Nice. Very cool.
I'm looking forward to trying Brain Beast.
Yes, we'll have to get you a Brain Beast.
If you have Brain Beast, I'll buy it before I leave, yeah.
I don't think we have it. We don't have it at Float House yet, but we will.
We will.
Yeah.
It's on the route.
Right. And, as usual, we have a bunch of community stuff that we do. Recently, I just took over the Man Talks position for Man Talks Vancouver. I had my first event last night. So if you want to speak at Man Talks sometime, now we have a direct link into that community as well. We had about 70 people come out, which was pretty awesome for the first one, and that was exciting. And we'll probably do a few more events in the fall. So if you want to connect with that, go to the mantalks.com. Or you can go to the Man Talks Facebook page, the group page, and join and be part of a men's community. Plus, we also have the Mindful Mass Meditation Mob. We have another meditation coming up on June 21st. This episode probably won't be out by then, but again, you can connect to the Mindful Mass Vancouver Meditation Flash Mob on Facebook and stay up to date on future meditation events. And of course, we have the Vancouver Real community, which we haven't done an event for a while, but I definitely like to get some more events rolling out. Candace and Sean have been really busy with their Life in Motion course that they're putting together for the Vancouver Real community. So they haven't launched any events recently. But we should get them going again. But we'll see what happens with that because they have a bun in the oven.
That's what happens when you pile on the plate of life too many things. It's hard to keep
up everything, right? But anyways, today we have a really exciting episode, and this one it came up originally in a Facebook post where Boldizar tagged us in a Jordan Peterson video, and then we had like a little online, friendly quarrel. And then Omid suggested, hey, why don't we put together a video of a critique of Jordan Peterson? Because, it's really difficult to critique him unless you're extremely well-read and capable of making a really good argument against some of the things that he says. And our guest today, Alexander Boldizar, fourth time on the show with us, and you're also an author. Your website is boldizar.com.
Yes.
You have a book called The Ugly. What else? Am I forgetting anything else?
Well, I'm on the board for the BC Federation of Writers now.
Nice.
I'm the Vancouver area rep for the BC Federation of Writers, and I'm on the board for Social Circus, which brings circus to underprivileged communities in different parts of the world.
Well, welcome back to the podcast.
So I talk about too many things on the plate, yeah.
Too many things on the plate, yeah. Boldizar's in that world for sure. And formerly known as the Anarchist Lawyer. I don't know if we should bring that back for today, but I still love the name. It just has a nice ring to it.
Playfulness is always good.
Yeah.
That's part of postmodernism, is to be playful.
Playful?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll get into that. And this is an epic occasion because Omid Pakbin is behind the mic for the first time on Vancouver Real as a guest. And if you've been following us for a while, you know Omid helped us start off the whole podcast and helps us with all the technical aspects, which Mike and I are just pretty not capable of doing. In fact, today Omid fixed up our computer. That's why the audio and video sounds so amazing. And he's going to put his Omid special on this video production. So it's going to be a really good episode because we got the master behind the mic. So welcome back.
Thank you.
And I heard you're living on Bowen Island now.
Right now, living on Bowen Island, July 31st, moving to our new home on Salt Spring.
That is amazing. That sounds like a dream. Like I've talked about so many times, we should get like something, like jointly have something outside of the city, and your situation sounds pretty epic. And
as long
ideal.
as you're living in the city, you kind of get used to the noise and the craziness of the city and the traffic and all that.
Yeah.
Still, it can be agitating, but you get used to it. But once you get out of the city and live like on Bowen for a while, every time
I'd probably lose some wrinkles in my forehead if I lived out of the city because I get this constant tension here. Like Mike and I were just on a family holiday down in the Caymans, and the island's so small. There's like 1,200 people down there. So when you're down there, you're just so kind of immersed in nature, and it's so relaxing. When I came back to Vancouver, my immediate response was, I need to get out of the city. But the funny thing is you adapt, right? And then all of a sudden it's like you're just back in traffic and city life and constant bombardment of stimulation. So you get used to it.
It does feel like it's getting busier though, Vancouver.
The traffic's getting worse, that's for sure. Like I drive a lot, and that's one thing I've noticed over the years is just traffic's getting worse, and there's construction everywhere now. So it's
Feels so calm compared to Montreal.
Is it calm?
Yeah, the last 6 months I've been in Montreal, right smack downtown, and it's a real urban environment. Vancouver's kind of a big village still compared to downtown Montreal.
Right.
And you always critique the drivers in Vancouver.
I do. I too. I think with good reason.
You have to be on your toes. Like when I'm driving, like there's a lot of near misses. Like you really have to be paying attention because someone's going to just drift into your lane or whatever. There's so many things that kind of go on, and you always say the Montreal drivers are the best drivers in Canada.
Well, they're much more aggressive, which everybody defines best in a different way. But Montreal drivers are aggressive, but they're aware. I think Vancouver drivers are all kind of sleepy and unaware. And true. So it's the lack of awareness that means if you are next to them, you might have to be on your toes. But I do think that driving here, everything happens slower. People kind of would prefer to be in a train. They stay in their lane. There's not much kind of reaction to the environment, whereas in Montreal or anywhere in the third world, it's much more like a video game. You gotta be reacting quickly.
Right.
You want to be alert. You don't want to be updating Facebook in Montreal. Here, you kind of need to be texting while driving or protect your brain from sclerosis.
That's true. So, anyways,
I wanted to kind of jump in because Omid used to do. I don't know if you still do. Like some people who have been a part of the show we always used to promote Omega Point YouTube channel. And it was part of the sponsorship because you used to help us with a lot of the editing behind the scenes for Vancouver Real. Things have shifted now. You just got super busy with projects, and we made it more automated here, which has helped a ton of just in terms of our efficiency. But in terms of Omega Point, can you kind of give people a little update about what one from you, what is Omega Point, why did you create it, what was it all about, where is it at now, and what's its future?
So you guys have started the podcast in 2014
May 2014.
So 2012, my timeline is basically, I came to Canada in 2010, and then in 2012 being kind of in a I'm lost and I don't know what I'm doing, I went for a mushroom experience. And you guys are probably familiar with, how much insight you can get on what you're doing with your life and all that.
Definitely.
So you look at life from a new perspective, right? So I got interested in listening to podcasts, listening to different people, and so that's age 24, and what I realized back then was how I became aware of my ignorance, so how much I don't know. And I started observing, like listening to different people, trying to read books, listening to audiobooks. I'm more of a listener than reader, but as I was listening to these ideas, I thought, okay, I can help spread them out, because there were certain ideas that I was listening to that I really liked, right? So I started Omega Point, and then that became my job, because I was learning to do animation, to put these videos out without really consciously thinking that, okay, I can do animation as my job. And that kind of evolved into that. And
but that is what you do now.
Yeah, so Omega Point was going until I made a video for Jason Silva.
Right.
Not for him. I just used part of his talk and made a video with his voice, and then he contacted me, and I started working for his YouTube channel, and then different people started contacting me. 2016, I got involved in a Netflix show project with Louis Schwartzberg. The show is called Moving Art. It's music and nature.
Right.
It's a series. I worked on season 2, and that's what gave me the power, or the kind of job security to leave the city, I guess.
Right.
Because I didn't need to get new contracts or anything, so just moved to Bowen, and it's going from there. I'm working on another show now, and yeah, so a bunch of big contracts. So and Omega Point is kind of paused now.
Okay, so it's not dead then. You're still gonna...
Right. So the Facebook page is there, the YouTube channel is there, and I started working on a new video.
Okay.
With Jordan Peterson's voice.
Okay.
And then halfway through that, I started saying things, and I felt like I'm not sure about putting this out there.
So there's something that he was saying that in that video, or just in general with his discourses?
I actually really love the message that he has in that particular video I was making. It was talking about how you need both the voice of the left and the right. And it's almost like it's like a dance between these two, that you want a voice between both, a dialogue always going.
Right.
And it's kind of really similar to my view, that it's like more a centrist type worldview.
That's probably a good little segue as to kind of why we wanted to have this episode with Alexander Boldizar and Omid here. Partially because of, like, I mean, for lack of a better term, who people are aware, like the Jordan Peterson phenomenon that's kind of happened over the last year and a half, how he's really been first blowing up, like, the podcast scene and YouTube, obviously, now into mainstream media, and then his book Timing came out, and like he's just on this kind of avalanche. Now he's doing like this public tour, and it's been just fascinating to kind of watch this guy go off, basically.
What's really interesting is that when we first, I think you put him on our radar originally, and back, what was like a year and a half ago, roughly
2 years ago.
2 years ago, you were actually emailing him, and he would respond in person. And now it's like he's one of those people that's almost out of reach unless you want to pay for him to come speak now, right? But it's been really interesting just watching his growth and his acceleration. And there's obviously like multiple reasons as to why he's taken off the way he is or has. But so
I can quickly give you what happened from my perspective. It was early 2016, I think, before what happened at the University of Toronto drama happened. 2 months before that, a friend of mine visited me on Bowen, and it was his friend that, in a conversation when I said I listened to Terrence McKenna, Alan Watts, and Robert Anton Wilson, and all these different people, he said, well, have you heard of Jordan Peterson? And I said, no. And he sent me, his lecture is called Tragedy and Evil. Still to this day, my favorite talk that he has. And so I listened to that. It was brilliant. And I contacted him on Facebook, and he replied back. So, but then after that, I started, he grew in terms of like, he
popularity,
kind of dived into a celebrity type status. So that brings me to one of the things that I don't like, and this is not something that it's not like wrong and right. It's personal taste. I prefer the type of intellectuals like Sam Harris and say Christopher Hitchens, who are a little more laid back and don't accept every single interview offer that they get, and it seems like Peterson is doing way too much, and I feel like that sometimes it seems to me that he tries to provoke in a way to get almost more views. Like,
so I think sometimes he'll say inflammatory things in order to get a reaction, and he's playing the media game, right? This is how media gets attention, right? They'll have some clickbait title, or they'll have some headline that's just the old sort of creed for the media: if it leads, it bleeds, right? So it's all about getting attention, getting viewer attention, and I think he's definitely leveraging that sort of tactic in order to get himself more attention. Which, worst case scenario. Well, I mean, there's potential other worst case scenarios, but I mean, he's trying to sell his book. You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, well,
yeah. Well, I think all good for him to make more money. It's just I'm not sure about that approach. It's like pop culture. Like, I can't tell you that pop culture, like Hollywood movies, are bad. I can't make an argument for that. I just go like, it's not my taste too. Most of them are like formulated scenarios that from after 5 minutes of the beginning of the film, I already know what's going to happen, and something like that. Like, I'm not saying what he's doing is wrong. It's just I don't like it, and it seems like there's a whole marketing team behind the whole thing.
Sure.
And
sure. I mean, but here's the thing too. Consider that he's a Canadian author,
right?
And how hard is it for Canadian authors to make it? You know what I mean? That's like you could probably speak on that a lot more. But from what I understand, it's like Canadian authors. It's rare for them to really get a lot of attention.
Yeah, just from the author perspective, my publisher's American, so I'm kind of in between. In a sense, it's hard to get Canadian attention because I have an American publisher. And I don't mind this aspect of Jordan Peterson. I don't mind the monetizing his fame, and I think there are very good reasons why he exploded what he did, especially in Canada. I think there are a lot of social pressures, and he's giving voice to political issues that people have been afraid to voice. And so from a practical and political and even psychological reasons, I think there are definitely really good reasons why he got the fame he did. And I don't begrudge him that, or monetizing, or taking every interview either. I do think, and it's very related, I do think that his intellectual approach is much more like a preacher than like a professor. And he brings kind of a pulpit type presentation style, which I think does feed into kind of the deeper intellectual critiques that I might have of how he gets to some of his positions, even though I think those positions need to be articulated, and I'm very grateful for him for articulating some of these arguments which people have become very cautious about making, and he's not cautious. And so we've been kind of starved for a voice like his, even though I think it's deeply flawed, and I think in some ways having him as a representative in the long term might end up biting in the butt the people who really care about free speech. Like I as an author, that's my number one most important issue with free speech.
Yeah.
And to the extent he's defending free speech, I will continue to be grateful for him, even though I think that a lot of his arguments are deeply flawed.
You know, the free speech issue, actually, you're the one who put it on my radar from the beginning. That was years ago, because you were just talking about like the defense of freedom of speech. And I think you said this on the podcast. You said something like the defense of free speech starts with the defending of the right of the unsavory to speak, or something like that.
Yeah. And once you start limiting free speech, the way these things work from a legal perspective is once you carve out exceptions, it's the people with power who get to lay claim to those exceptions. So once you start creating categories of speech that's banned, it's just a matter of time before, say, Donald Trump or the people who have in power say, hey, what you're saying about me is hateful, so it's hate speech, so it's going to be banned. So I think that the identitarian left, or the social justice warrior, whatever label you want to put on the progressive woke left, I think they're being short-sighted in their attacks on free speech, because in the end it's the left that will suffer from limitations on free speech. And so my defense of free speech doesn't come from a right-wing point. It comes from a kind of liberal, but not identitarian liberal approach to the importance of, there's no change. Every other possibility of change and dissension and anything pre-violent, any change that doesn't include physical violence is rooted in the ability to speak, the ability to identify injustice. And once you start creating exceptions to that, those exceptions are not going to stay with the disempowered. They're going to be claimed by the powerful. And so that's why I consider myself a free speech absolutist, even though I don't consider myself a conservative.
Right. So I think we can agree that like the free speech thing is extremely important. And like you said yourself that like, you know, that's something that you're glad that's been brought to the forefront because of him. But that's not the main issues that you have with him. Like you have some other critiques of him, particularly some of the things that he's been, I guess, espousing against, and what he's based his arguments on. So a lot of it has to do with like postmodernism and Derrida and critiques on those particular things. And like you said before, it's going to take a while for you to dive into this. So I'm not sure where you want to start with that, but I think maybe this is a good place to jump off to that.
Sure. And again, you can have, and I think that's one thing that we're losing a little bit in society, is the ability to not choose teams, but focus on individual issues and even parts of arguments and say, I agree with this, but disagree with that. You can agree with somebody's ultimate conclusion without agreeing with the intermediate steps they necessarily use to get there.
Right.
Sir Isaac Newton spent 30 years researching alchemy, and it was his knowledge of alchemy that led him to the theory of gravity.
Right.
That doesn't mean that the theory of gravity is any less useful. It's correct, and it's mostly correct in non-Einsteinian space. But that doesn't mean that alchemy is a valid approach to getting to gravity. And I think Jordan Peterson has some of the same problems or similar
if
analogous.
that's the case, though, and he is getting to, say, a place that you would agree on, then, doesn't that mean that there is alchemy is maybe a different example, but he's got there in a different way, which maybe could be valid as well, though?
Not necessarily, because you see a lot of people who defend free speech who defend it only when their own speech is attacked. And it just happens that in Canada, in university setting, it's right now conservatives who are being attacked on using the basis of hate speech and with Bill C-16 that made Peterson famous, basically compelled speech with the gender pronouns, though he did kind of exaggerate the legal issues there. So I think it's only free speech when you're defending the speech of people with whom you disagree. If you're defending the free speech of people with whom you agree, you're defending that position, not necessarily the right to repulsive speech or speech that you disagree with. But in terms of how, what I think is the biggest flaw in Peterson's kind of intellectual structure is, if you listen to him talk, almost always he uses the phrase postmodern Marxist or postmodern neo-Marxist. And that's such a weird oxymoron to me. Postmodernism is extremely difficult to define because by its own precepts, it avoids grand narratives. It's a set of rhetorical and strategic and critical tools that are used to weaken or destabilize concepts. It's a tool, but a lot of postmodernists wouldn't even accept it as a tool because they don't want any kind of firm ism in postmodernism. So there's no postmodernist on the planet that I know of that will self-identify as a postmodernist, because it's basically an extension of modernism that seeks to get away from grand narratives. And Marxism is the grandest narrative. It's this incredibly structured approach to history that the end result is the socialist utopia of Marxism and stuff like that. If you look back at the history of how these concepts were created, modernism was a reaction against tradition, and Jordan Peterson is very much about bringing back tradition. So modernism basically said, let's do away with tradition, let's create. A good example would be Picasso. Picasso broke down perspective. He got away from traditional representational paintings of landscapes or a woman, and said, well, why do I need to look at a woman's face from one perspective? Why can't I look at it from 3 perspectives at once? So Picasso is a very good example of modernist painter. All abstract art, books that get away from kind of the standard plot, surrealist books, those are all considered modernist. If you look at, and they have different strands, of course. It's not a simple, unified idea. The French and the Italians and stuff, they all go in slightly different directions. And same with postmodernism. When postmodernism is basically an extension of modernism in some ways, but it's a rejection of the. So the way that modernism attacks tradition, postmodernism extends that to attacking any grand narrative, any kind of. So in France, which the French were obsessed with structural ideas, it became about using those structures to critique themselves. In Italy, it became about using aesthetics in place of reason or along with reason. And the idea is that once you do away with grand narratives, all you're left with is these individual little moments that have meaning. So it's a very complicated idea, and it's basically, even reading someone like Derrida, he refuses to define his own terms, because he says the moment they're defined, they become a concept. The whole thing started with Nietzsche, which again is weird because Jordan Peterson calls himself a Nietzschean. Nietzsche, following Kant, had this idea: you can't know things in themselves. You can't know a coffee cup as a thing. You can only know a representation of it. Similar in some ways to Buddhist ideas.
Right.
So Nietzsche said you can't know things in themselves. You can only know metaphors or images or representations of things. Nietzsche went on to say things like truth.
Can you break that down a little bit? Like, what does that mean? Like, does that mean that like you can have a coffee cup and you have an idea of what a coffee cup is, but you don't know exactly what that is because you can't break it down to like the nuances of what makes a coffee cup a coffee cup? Is that what you're talking about? Is that the right interpretation of that?
Partially, but it's also an issue of mediation. So I can only see I can see within a limited range of vision. I have a limited ability to see what's actually here, in terms of wavelengths of light or whatever. This wouldn't be the way he analyzed it. But it was more about, it's a representation in my head of a coffee cup. It's also influenced by the fact that I've seen a million coffee cups before, so I can no longer see this one purely because I'm shaped by all these. So I have a metaphor. So what I'm looking at here is a metaphor of a coffee cup that's shaped by a lifetime of other coffee cups that I've seen.
Yeah.
And so Kant was the first one to come up with this idea that you can't know a thing in itself. You can only know your own mental representation of it.
Right.
But Kant still followed these Platonic ideals, the idea that there is an abstract, unified coffee cup in everybody's head. Nietzsche went on to say, not just with coffee cups are a little bit of a too simple an example, but Nietzsche's famous quote that in Truth and Lies in a non-moral sense is that all truths are metaphors that we've forgotten are metaphors. So everything that we think of as a truth is basically just a matter of forgetting and making unequal things equal. So when I refer to a coffee cup in conversation, there's a JJ Bean coffee cup, there's a Starbucks coffee cup, there's a Beans on Lonsdale coffee cup. They're all slightly different, but I say coffee cup as one concept. I'm equating a bunch of unequal things by deciding what the relevant characteristics are. And so every representation of every idea is, in a sense, has a lie within it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
If you look in a movie, an old pre-digital movie, analog movie, there's more black space than actual shots, but our brains process it as a movie. That's, again, metaphor for how we interpret all aspects of reality. We ignore all the dark space in order to see an image and a representation to create a concept. And so that became the first kind of breaking down of traditional notions of reality. So traditionalists believed reality was very kind of blocky and simple, and there was a coffee cup and there was a person and I that was acting on it. Then modernists followed Nietzsche in breaking down the ability to have this unmediated understanding. So we were already dealing with all truths are relative to some extent. All truths have lies within them. The postmodernists took this even further and said, for example, Derrida has this concept of you can't know what a house is. Everything is relative to the extent that if I say the word house, a house makes, as a word, makes no sense without a concept of a shed, a mansion, a hotel, that we basically situate the meaning of the word house within a locus of other meanings. So we don't learn by looking at a million pictures of houses. That's machine learning algorithms, and even they would end up creating a separate category for shed and hotel and mansion to distinguish what a house is, or building. And so everything is contextual, everything is relative. And so once you start accepting that all language, all concepts only make sense in relation to other concepts, and then you look at those concepts, and they all only make sense in relation to other concepts, it becomes impossible to have simplistic debates about what's true and what's not without context. And what postmodernists did, they applied this to everything. And they didn't do it in order to get to nihilism. In a sense, it's almost modernism, late modernism was at risk of becoming nihilism because nothing mattered. Everything was relative. Everything was contextual. And so postmodernists were saying that doesn't have to go to nihilism. And when Jordan Peterson talks about postmodernism, he's using it as a synonym for nihilism. And it's postmodernism said you can still find meaning.
You say nihilism, you mean like nihilism?
Nihilism, sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
You can still find meaning in tiny little moments. And the reason that I find his approach to this label of postmodern neo-Marxist nonsensical is he's usually using it to attack identitarians, people who, create these identity groups or protected groups. Derrida, who is probably the person that Peterson cites most often, he has an entire book called Monolingualism of the Other, a prosthesis of origin, where he breaks down the concept of cultural identity. He says, I have one language and it is not mine. Derrida uses language as a proxy for culture, where he shows how every single language only makes sense by stealing from other languages and in relation to other languages. And the idea of cultural appropriation, Derrida would find it ridiculous because he would say there's no meaning, there's no culture without appropriation. There's no language without borrowing from other languages. Every language belongs to somebody else. No language belongs just to yourself, but that doesn't mean it belongs to somebody else. From every single person's perspective, your language is taken from somebody else's language. English is very obvious with Germanic and Latinate roots, but it even has elements of Slovak. The word robot was Czech, actually. It comes from robota, which means to work.
I like how you slid that in.
I'd like to, yeah. So I want to just jump back to this idea of, we can't just reduce the coffee cup back to a single truth of what a coffee cup is because it's too complicated, right? But isn't that necessary for human beings to have to be able to do that to deal with the complexity of the world? Like, how can we, if we thought about how infinitely vast a coffee cup could be, it's too confusing. So it's like we have to conceptualize it as a coffee cup in order for us to be able to function in the world.
Sure, on the level of a coffee cup, we need to do that because we have to order coffee. But on the level of a culture or an identity group, it does far more damage than good. So when you start talking, on the way here, I passed a homeless guy who looked like a university professor, white-haired, actually quite clean. Somebody would say, white male, he must have white privilege. And this guy's begging for money, he doesn't have, he's homeless. So for me, it's very hard to think about white privilege when I see a homeless guy and apply it to him. So once you start creating these generalizations, which the identitarian left loves to do, this is like what Joe Rogan calls toxic tribalism.
Right.
It's toxic because it's not true. You can't create a circle around a million people, a billion people, or even two people
Because everyone's an individual.
Everybody's an individual.
Yeah.
Now, what Jordan Peterson focuses on is that the postmodernists often went beyond that and started breaking down even an individual. So when you were talking about Mike was talking about doing his personality test, I asked which Alexander Boldizar should do the test. I was joking, because the postmodernists did go even beyond the individual. For me, for my own politics, I would stop at the individual, but I recognize that there's a lot of value in, I would answer that personality test in a completely different way if I were in my jiu-jitsu dojo, or if I were with my partner, if I were with my son. My levels of agreeableness, for example, would be much higher if my son is sitting in the same room, because it's triggering a different driver. And on a neurological, biological, it's funny because Jordan Peterson attacks people for ignoring evolutionary biology, but it's been pretty well established in neurology that our brains don't work with one identity that is kind of essentialized and goes through life. It's triggered by context. Not 100%, not you're a drastically different person, but you are a subtly different person in every situation in life. So if I'm in my role as father, I'm going to be a different personality slightly than in my role on the mats with a bunch of jiu-jitsu guys where we're trying to strangle each other. And that's pretty well established. And in a sense, that's a lot of what the postmodernists were saying. They were breaking down identity, that it is partially socially constructed. That doesn't mean it's fully socially constructed. And again, even within the postmodernists, there are a lot of different people, and there are people like Lacan, who was basically a Freudian, and he's the one that's been used by a lot of the kind of the gender warriors, because for him everything was a phallus. But that didn't come out of his being a postmodernist. It came out of him being a Freudian postmodernist. If you look at Lyotard, who came up with the word postmodernism in his book, A Postmodern Condition, he basically said postmodernism is not a system, it's playful experimentation. It's a skepticism of entrenched concepts, and it's meant to be constantly playful. It's a way of pushing back against questions instead of coming up with answers. So when Jordan Peterson blames postmodernists for creating the woke left, it makes no sense to me, because the woke left is all about creating these untouchable, sacred ideals around identity. To me, the woke left is actually psychologically very conservative. They feel like people who are psychological conservatives that grew up in progressive households, and so the values that they're traditionalist about, that they're conservative about, are progressive values. Right. But they bring in unexamined thought to protecting a tradition of their boomer hippie parents. They're usually very financially well off, quite privileged, and they're protecting ideas as opposed to questioning them. Whereas postmodernism is all about attacking concepts.
Right. So,
or destabilizing, not attacking.
Well,
destabilizing
my view after 2 years of almost weekly, I mean, not every single day, but following Peterson's work on at least weekly basis, and I've listened to countless hours of his lectures. My view is that a lot of these people are experts in one area. Like Peterson is a brilliant psychologist, clinical psychologist. And a lot of these type of intellectuals, if they go and try to cover other areas of like philosophy or science, they oftentimes get things wrong. And I really respect Peterson when it comes to clinical psychology. I think his work and his Patreon contribution, like he's making over $100,000 a month.
He turned it off. You don't know. We don't really know, but.
Well, it was up to 68,000.
Yeah.
And the number of people have almost doubled. So it's probably
so you can estimate. That. Yeah.
But a lot of left-wing media attack him, going like, well, these are right-wing people. You're being their voice, and that's why they're giving you money. From my perspective, being active on Reddit and other websites that Peterson fans basically communicate with each other. It seems like most of those people are contributing because he's helped them to change their life, like to give them purpose or something.
So more for the psychological aspects of what he talks about.
I think he's brilliant when it comes to psychological development and personal development, but he gets things wrong. And in his Reddit Ask Me Anything, which happened like 2 weeks ago, one of his comments got like minus 2,000 karma or something. He basically wrote Nazis were atheists and they did what they did because they were atheists,
which is nonsense.
Which is, as far as I know, is nonsense, and you're agreeing with me. But it seems like Peterson sometimes get things wrong, and that's fine. But I don't think he goes to talk to people who can challenge him properly enough. He goes on television shows that they're kind of shallow in the way they question.
Well, for sure. Like the Kathy Newman interview was just ridiculous, right? So he's been in the mainstream media. He's been definitely very unfairly judged, for sure.
Absolutely.
Like your critique of him is like 100 times more sophisticated than what he normally gets, mainstream channels, right?
And it's because, and I understand why, because I struggled and stumbled on trying to encapsulate the history of modernism and postmodernism in something that fit under 5 minutes.
So it's very complicated.
So you're not going to get that even in this format. It's awkward.
Yeah.
Trying to do it in a TV format with the entire interview 3 minutes is impossible.
Right.
Well, and also those people just don't know. You know what I mean? Like that's it is like one element of the Peterson phenomenon that has kind of impacted me is how I didn't even understand. Well, I didn't understand the concept of ideological possession and what that means, and maybe you can comment on whatever that means, if that means anything to you. But the idea of like how, say, some of these ideas have permeated into my mind, and I just kind of accept them for whatever. And then it was funny because of what happened with Jordan Peterson about the gender pronoun and the white privilege and the social justice warrior antithesis, I guess you could say, like his kind of claim to fame almost. The reason why I was really interested, because there was elements of social justice that really started to I didn't understand why it bothered me, but it also, but I didn't have an explanation of why it was maybe wrong. You know what I mean? And that's just a lack of not knowing and diving into it. But
sorry, do you want more to say?
No, that's it.
I just wanted to jump in because I went to McMaster and I studied sociology, just a BA, right? But sociology is all about groups, right? And I had a lot of sort of, if you want to talk about the more far leftist or leftist ideas of group identities and that sort of thing. In fact, you can argue that for a long time we've built a lot of the Vancouver Real channel on very leftist things. In fact, when Trudeau was running, we were pushing Trudeau stuff and we were anti-Trump, and we anti-Harper too, and we were also so we did develop. And the funny thing is, when I was posting very pro-left ideological friendly videos or whatever, our following was just going up and up and up and up. And then Peterson came along and he sort of balanced the equation for us, right? I'm getting off base a little bit here, but I think going back to what you were talking about, in sociology and the humanities, this is what Jordan Peterson, a big part of his argument is, I think that there is a lot of programming that goes on in those, and that's where I feel I got a lot of those very leftist ideas sort of implanted in me. And I'm an impressionable, what do I know? I'm out of high school, I'm doing my BA. Oh yes, you're the authority, Mr. Professor. I'm going to believe everything that you tell me. I'm paying for this education, and I came out of it with a certain viewpoint. And I think this is what I want to relate back to you is the idea that I feel what you're saying is I'm sure is very technically true in terms of your critique of his mislabeling of postmodernism, neo-Marxist. But I feel maybe he has taken elements that has come out of that to give sort of the ideology that sort of has permeated a lot of Canadian culture a name. Right? It's just this is because it's well, what is it? Because you know what I mean? Because Trudeau ran his entire campaign on those values, and it worked. So it's I think he's just kind of labeling this is what I think this is.
But that's an argumentative fallacy. That's a straw man fallacy. He's creating postmodernism as a straw man in basically nihilism and Marxism. These are trigger words that he can use, and he repeats them over and over, almost like a politician, without them having very much of a relationship with what he's actually critiquing. The Marxist critique I get, because there is a very consistent. You can see the historical and intellectual transition between the people that in the 70s and 80s may have been Marxists as the Soviet Union fell apart. You can see how they would kind of morph into social justice warriors and attacking instead of attacking capitalism, attacking patriarchy or whatever. But when he's using postmodernism, again, postmodernism is not fully opposed. It's more of an extension of modernism. And both the Nazis and the Soviet Union banned modernist art, banned modernist work. The Soviets, from Stalin on, called it elitist, and the Nazis called it degenerate, and they would show modernist art like Picasso next to work by schizophrenics. And the reason they did it is because they broke with tradition. And Peterson is fundamentally a traditionalist. He's driven by, I think, the Christian Bible stuff from him is not a side hobby. It's where everything comes from. And I agree he's done a lot of good. And in his response to Kathy Newman, where basically he was saying, well, the alt-right is following me. Isn't it better that I pulled him back from the alt-right toward a more responsible, productive member of society? Like, I'm not sure what the people critiquing him for that fact that alt-right members are following him are presenting as an alternative. He is a much better alternative in terms of preaching personal responsibility than going and waving tiki torches and spewing
100%,
hate.
yeah.
And so he's doing a really good thing. But
Well, that's where the media gets him wrong, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that. But again, it's weird to me how people, even in their ideology, become tribal. When you're talking about ideological possession, you basically, okay, I agree with 60% of what this guy says. I must buy into the other 40%. It's like, well, why? You're a thinking person, that your belief system should be filtered through. Every thought should be filtered. Do you actually agree with?
I feel like that Peterson himself kind of promotes that way of thinking, and I've noticed if you go on, for example, Reddit and Jordan Peterson's subreddit, you're very welcome to criticize him doing it properly. Same thing happens on Sam Harris's. If I'm a subscriber to his podcast, there are forums that his fans can participate in, and they're all the time doing it. And that's what I think separates them from
totally. And the one thing, like, just to add on to that, like, every negative article that's ever been published about Peterson, he reshares on his own channels. He's not trying to hide it, right, that this is happening.
And most of them are bullshit.
Most of them. Yeah. So, like, a lot of it's like, in a way, it's sort of reinforcing that, well, if you want to share it, obviously, it's kind of showing that what the media is trying to portray him as is completely not accurate, right?
But he does show the absurd criticisms. I'm not sure if he shows the ones that hit home, because because a lot of the criticisms of Peterson are ridiculous. And so showing ridiculous criticisms of yourself, in a sense, immunizes you against some of the more valid criticisms as well.
Right.
So I'm not sure how much credit I give him for reposting critical pieces of him when the opposition is so blatantly of their head in the sand.
I mean, I haven't really heard any really good critiques of him, and this is what we're trying to create today, right? And I wanted to get, there's so many things we could touch on, like the ideological possession, and we could talk about tribalism for sure. But I want to keep going back to you about, how can you further, is there more that you want to add to, like, your critique of Peterson? Like, is there more that you can add to what you've said already?
I guess the fact that his foundation comes from, is internally inconsistent, isn't probably just a side issue either. I do think in a sense, it hints towards a certain intellectual dishonesty. And that's what worries me because as he becomes a spokesman for kind of pushing back against the repression that is growing in the universities. The fact that he's a flawed representative of that pushback could end up weakening us in the same way that I'm not a conservative, but if I were a conservative, I'd be very upset about Trump because, in a sense, Trump is going to do massive damage to Republican and conservative thinking for a generation. In the same way, having a flawed representative of your viewpoint can really come back to bite you in the ass.
Totally.
And I don't want, and he is getting a lot of liberals who are kind of more moderate liberals siding with him. Look at Lindsay Shepherd at Laurier.
Yeah.
She initially was a liberal. I mean, but she just happened to present a show that had him as one side of the debate, and for that she was chastised and went through the entire review board meeting. And I do feel that universities tend to be a generation ahead of the rest of society. So this stuff, it starts in universities. I think it starts in, actually, not to toot my own horn, but in the ugly, I had some very similar issues happening, and I had a quote saying that Harvard's a generation ahead of the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Ahead of America, America's a generation ahead of the rest of the world. And I think that's also true with some of these repressive ideas that are coming out of academia. They start in academia, then they move into Silicon Valley, and then they move into corporations more broadly. And you already see it with with Damore at Google, where the guy just applied basically an engineering, very naive approach. There was a diversity presentation. They asked for feedback. At first he didn't even give it, so they asked again, we really want some feedback. So he gave them feedback, and then that feedback ended up getting him fired because somebody reposted it on an internal board, and then it got publicized. Right. And so you see it starting to spread and percolate and seep through culture. And you don't need 50% in order to have these thoughts kind of start dominating. You need a powerful 10% that will push it, and a lot of people who are afraid. And I know in publishing, if you look at the left-right breakdowns, in publishing is almost 100% left. So I know I'm, even though I consider myself a liberal, because I do push back against some of these more tribalistic instincts on the left, just because I think they're short-sighted and they're self-cannibalizing in the long run. I worry that I'm undermining my writing future because these are unpalatable thoughts, and we're getting to not quite where it was like in Czechoslovakia, where I escaped from, because the damage is only to your career. You don't end up in a gulag, but it's your reputation, and it's playing dirty in a sense, and it puts a dampener on a free exchange of ideas, which is what is the beauty of the West. We separated words and ideas from physical violence, and that let us question it, let us grow. It created progress in art and science and literature, in democracy, purely because we were allowed to question tradition. And now the social justice warrior left is creating the same types of moats around their ideas that the Catholic Church created for 1,000 years. And so that's why I don't think Peterson is a good candidate for pushing back, because in the end, what he's looking for is kind of something more like the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. It's just because that strain of thought is on the defensive right now. He's representative of free speech. But the whole reason postmodernists are associated with the left, and not all were left, there were some right-wing postmodernists like Deleuze, it's associated with the left because when they were writing in the 70s, they were still fighting entrenched power structures from which were mostly right-wing, capitalism, corporations, the state, and so because they're destabilizing traditional thought. I'm sure if a lot of these postmodernists were around now, they'd be attacking the left just as much.
Right. Then maybe right there kind of like illustrates how, the postmodern approach is being used to sort of destabilize anything that's on the right, and which is exactly what the far left is doing, right? So that's why he's labeled it postmodernism, because he's like, if if the whole purpose of postmodernism is to destabilize power structures, and the left is doing that, would that not mean that they are postmodernists, in that we're acting like that at least?
Well, that's like calling skepticism. It's basically postmodernism is just a playful approach to skepticism and saying that meaning is found on tiny little micro levels. A good example is science, for example. Lyotard included science among the big structures that he was attacking, along with Marxism, and Darwinism is a very modernist idea. And so these modernist structural systems, when the postmodernists started extending modernist ideas to attacking their own structures, science was included. And the biggest critique of that argument was that science is not actually one structure. It's an aggregation of tiny micro discoveries. And that's what the postmodernists, in a sense, seek. They say meaning is to be found in these tiny micro additions to a body of knowledge, not in conceiving of a whole concept as a whole. And so, in a sense, the internet is very postmodern, because it's created by the aggregation of trillions of minor interactions. And so if the left is creating concepts, like the patriarchy as a concept is completely antithetical to postmodernism. No postmodernists will sit there and talk about the patriarchy. Yes, Lacan used the phallus as a symbol for everything, but once you start creating these concepts, you're no longer acting as a postmodernist. And the left is constantly creating these concepts. Yes. Cultural appropriation, white privilege, male mansplaining, creating men. There's an article in the New York Times lately, why can't we hate men? Postmodernists attack the idea of a male-female dichotomy. Mm-hmm. They attacked, and so yes, it's used, for example, to say now, well, there's not just two genders. There can be a trillion genders. So that is a postmodern move to break down the two genders. But attacking men as a gender is not a postmodern move. You are essentializing a category of male.
Right.
So
okay, I understand exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
So it's like you cannot label the far left as postmodernists, basically, in the strictest definition of the term postmodernist. Like, they're not that, based on how they're behaving and acting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But not even the strictest. If there's any definition of postmodernist, it's not just leftist. It's attacking concepts, destabilizing concepts. And the left is not just working with concepts. They're saying you can't even question these concepts.
Yes.
Like the left is saying, if you say there's no wage gap, you are treated the way somebody 200 years ago would be if they said there's no God.
Yeah.
Within that social circle, you can't even argue. You are ostracized just for making an intellectual argument. And that is very traditionalist and very dogmatic in its approach. It's very conservative.
Coming back to your idea of the conservative psychology, but raised in a liberal environment.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Oh. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, then let's just say let's say you were Jordan Peterson, you were in his position. How would you criticize the left then? Like what's the way, instead of calling them postmodernist neo-Marxists, what would you do to criticize the left?
I would use the language of the left to criticize it. And I would also try to point out how, from a political standpoint, I would show how self-cannibalizing it is. The left is destroying itself. I mentioned a little bit about the free speech, that the free speech has always historically, if you look at the history of free speech, it's always empowered the weak against the strong. And repressions on free speech have always been done by the powerful. Look at Iran. Who is repressing speech? The Ayatollah and the Clerical Council. Look at Czechoslovakia. It was the government that was repressing speech. Look at Trump's attempts to shut down the free press. And with the meeting with Kim yesterday, the American press was not allowed in. It's always the powerful that will limit free speech. And we've created certain cultural institutions in the West which are extremely powerful, or were extremely powerful, in protecting a space for disagreement, because we learned, Americans learned from the Revolutionary War, and they learned that you can't sit there and protect individual ideas. What you can do is protect a space for a clash of ideas. And that's where you create freedom and openness inside the system. And by shutting that down for good moral reasons, it might help so long as the culture is still one of progressive, support for marginalized groups. But the minute that culture shifts, all that space that you close off, you're not going to have the ability to dissent anymore. You're going to end up in a totalitarian system out of your own creation.
Right.
And I think that's on the political level, that's what I would say to the left, is that you're being incredibly short-sighted. And on an intellectual level, I would, again, I used to read a lot of feminist critical writers when I was at Harvard, like Lucie Regret was a French feminist scholar, first wave feminist, not third and fourth wave. And her whole thing was about this idea of focusing on gender blocks off a range of discursive possibilities. It blocks off much more interesting conversations. And what's the modern left doing? Everything is constantly about gender. And men, it's gotten to a point where, you can make comments about white males that would, if you just swapped out a different category in there, you would be fired, shut out, ostracized, everything else.
Yeah.
But once you start saying that it's okay to talk that way about white males, all those white males will say, well, look, this tribalism is okay, so why can't we do it too?
Right.
And that's how you end up with Trump.
Yeah.
And,
So the left, in your opinion, that's sort of how the left almost created the environment that Trump could become president in.
Absolutely.
Well, the couple of times that I tried to have a conversation about wage gap, which is, I think when Peterson talks about it, I think he's right, that there are a lot more reasons than just you being a man and the other person being a woman. There's more to it than that. It didn't pass 2 minutes down the conversation because the person that or people that I was having conversation with would get so emotional. And so, like, the first response was, well, you're saying that because you're a man.
Yeah.
Well, how can I argue with that?
And that's the definition of ad hominem. Ad hominem, as a logical fallacy, means addressing the person. Hominem from human. So you're, instead of addressing the idea, you're addressing the speaker. And that
So you're trying to discredit the speaker by
yeah,
discrediting who he is.
As opposed to the idea.
Right.
And ever since the time of Aristotle and Cicero, ad hominem was, if you engage ad hominem, you've lost the argument. You're attacking the speaker, not the idea.
Yeah.
And suddenly, we've made that okay again. But that's actually with the wage gap, it's an interesting idea of how postmodernists would address, for example, the male-female injustices. A structuralist approach would say, men are winning in society and women have it tougher. A postmodernist would say you can't make grand statements like that. No, you have to just get deeper and deeper. You can talk about look at family law. Are you seriously going to say in family law that men have it better? They don't. Maybe men have it better in certain spheres of life, yes. But there are spheres of life where women have it better. And a postmodernist would break down each argument by showing how the internal inconsistencies and internal situations by the time you get down to the individual, and then even under the individual level of each particular situation is its own scenario.
Yes.
That is a postmodernist mindset.
Okay, I want to just jump in real quick right there. Because that is basically, Peterson's saying you have to judge people at the level of the individual. That's what the big part of his argument is. That's basically a postmodernist approach to attacking the left.
Yes, except that postmodernists do continue beyond the individual, and that's where he objects. He says that postmodernists claim that the individual is also socially constructed. And that's, again, comes back to a bit of irony where he calls himself a Nietzschean. It's getting a little philosophical again, but he labels himself a Nietzschean. Nietzsche has an argument in the Genealogy of Morals where he says the I was socially constructed because of the need to take responsibility. Part of Peterson's taking responsibility. But Nietzsche's argument was that we've created a social an idea of identity as an individual because we need to take responsibility for the consequences of our actions. And it's only in the relationship to other people and being able to be bound by your word and the responsibility and that responsibility is social. So Nietzsche was the first person to come up with the idea of a socially constructed identity of self, because you are who you are by relationship to your promises, your responsibilities, and everything else. So again, there's an internal intellectual inconsistency with him calling himself a Nietzschean. I mean, Nietzsche was the precursor for the postmodernists. They took most of what the argument.
I mean, if he's calling himself a Nietzschean, and he's, sort of following Nietzsche's precursor to postmodernism, and he is using that to attack the left.
Yeah,
it's a weird thing, because he's kind of using, in a sense, postmodernism
he's picking and choosing.
Yeah.
Well, he does a lot of postmodernist moves.
Yeah.
His debate with Sam Harris, where he
about truth.
About truth.
Yeah.
His epistemology is not traditional, because he didn't want to get pinned down. He knew if he went to epistemology, means theory of knowledge, his idea of truth was Darwinist, that whatever is socially successful is truth. Well, then if the SJWs win and they become successful and they create a rule that conservatives can't procreate, does that mean that he's wrong and then they're speaking the truth? Yeah. It's an extremely relativistic, not even postmodern, but relativistic approach to truth. And he rails against relativism. Now, the reason he did that is because he knew that if he tried to argue for scientific truth, which is what Harris was pushing for, they would get in a conversation of God, and it would become very difficult for him to justify God on a scientific basis. So that's why I think a lot of these moves, a lot of these internally inconsistent moves, are driven by a need for him to bring God back. But he's doing it in the language of Jung because it's cooler and hipper, and he's doing it in the language of these Darwinistic approaches to truth. He won't get pinned down. If you ask Peterson, and people have, do you believe in God? He says that's a very complicated question.
Right.
Yeah.
And he doesn't say how it's complicated. He just avoids the question. I think that very much of this is driven by an attempt to revive traditionalism as in pre-modern.
Well, he'll usually say, it depends what you mean by belief, and it depends what you mean by God.
Which again is a postmodernist move to break down drill down into a concept and break it down into its component parts until you open it up. It's like these meditations, Vipassana meditations, where you go into your pain point and you open it up and you keep getting deeper and deeper.
Right.
That's the postmodernist approach to concepts. And in certain moments, Peterson repeats that move. In other concepts, he acts like, of course, it's self-evident. It's black and white. It's
right.
I want. There's so many things that we could go down with this conversation, but talking about the whole Sam Harris thing. When they come to town, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson are going to be a big part of what they're going to be debating. Will most likely be this idea of free will, right? And Sam Harris is he's hard, no free will. He's pure deterministic, and Jordan Peterson says that he believes that there is free will. So it's it's weird because. It's just difficult for me to try to say right now, but how, Jordan Peterson is kind of making room for, say, God, if you want to call it that, spirit, whatever, anything you want to call it, where Sam Harris will make zero room for that. But
Christians have to believe in free will. It's the nature of, not just Christians, all the Abrahamic religions are fundamentally based on a covenant with God. So the biggest divide in culture in the world is between the cultures that grew out of Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, the whole Eastern culture, where basically God is everything. God split into male and female, in male and female cows, male and female humans, and everything into dichotomies. And your only job as a human being is to achieve moksha, which is this realization that we are actually unified. So you are God, we are all God, and the only job we as humans have is to bring that back and have that realization.
Who said this, sorry?
That's all the Eastern religions. Jain, Hindu, Buddhism. They all have what you call satori or moksha or whatever. It's this realization of the unity of God and universe.
Right.
All the Abrahamic religions, starting with Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all have a concept of there's a separation between humans and God. Humans have free will. There's a covenant where basically we use that free will to do good works, and in exchange we get to spend eternity with God, but we are not God. So you need that free will in order to have the covenant. You can't have a contract if both parties don't have a free will. And in a sense, that's why Western religions probably had the Industrial Revolution first, because it was very much about you had power over your environment. You were not predetermined. So an entire East of the world believes in that everything is predetermined. We just might not be able to see it. The West tends to believe in free will because you need that free will in order to have a contract with God. And so Jordan Peterson has to believe in free will in order to maintain his Christian ethic.
Now, this is one thing I just want to point out, because I think we've talked about this before in the past, and like, because you're an atheist, right?
Yeah.
But and Jordan Peterson, but you also believe in free will.
Sort of. This is one of those. I believe the question of free will versus determinism is basically a question of perspective. Mm-hmm. So this answer frustrates people because it doesn't. It's kind of a postmodernist, perspectivist approach. If you're looking from the perspective of an acting individual, yes, we have free will.
Yeah.
If you're looking from the perspective of God, if you somehow could see, which there's no such thing, but if you could see from the universe from outside, and again, Derrida said there's no outside text. Not that there's nothing outside the text, but there is no non-contextual space. So, but if there were such a space, then it would look predetermined. And I know it's not answering, like, do I believe in free will or do I believe in the predeterminism? It really is a question of what perspective you're looking at the universe.
Well, I can put it this way. If you assume that the universe is everything that is happening is predetermined, from your perspective, there's no way for you to know what's happening next. It's just practically impossible. So therefore, from your perspective, you have free will, because if it's predetermined, you can't access that information.
That doesn't mean it's an illusion. So determinists will say that is just an illusion. Mm-hmm. It's an illusion from the other person's perspective.
Right.
It's not an illusion from my a perspectivist approach. We're so brought up to believe in universal values. Mm-hmm. And again, postmodernists don't believe in universal values. So, but coming from a Christian or Judeo-Christian cultural background, we believe there is such a thing as good and evil. And again, Derrida would say, because you need good to define evil, and each of these things, they're defined infinitely against each other, they're on this giant web, and it's
that's a very
turtles all the way
Eastern
down.
sort of philosophy, really, if you think of it that way.
In some ways, it is. And there are some similarities between postmodernism and Buddhism, but it's like a different flavor, a different tilt, because for Buddhism has basically the wisdom and the care or compassion side. So this would be the pure wisdom side of Buddhism, in a sense, would be postmodernism, without the compassion side necessarily, because it's an intellectual project. But then you do have, like, the Italian postmodernists will bring aesthetics into evaluating everything. And again, I see why there's a certain frustration that Peterson would have, because there's a certain mystical element, or postmodernism can appear very mystical to Anglo-Saxon philosophers. Analytic school philosophers believe in logic, and they believe that you come to arguments through a logical, reasonable progression of ideas. Postmodernists often will engage in what's called the Hermeneutic Circle, and I was trying to think of a metaphor for that, and it's the way you learn jiu-jitsu, for example. You don't learn jiu-jitsu by just building one building block on another. There's an element of that, but really you go around, you learn a move, and then you do it again, and then you see more nuances, and you go around again and you see more nuances, and you start coming closer and closer to getting the essence of a particular move through this hermeneutic circle, hermeneutic meaning learning. And in The Ugly, I play with this. Like I have a postmodernist character in the book, and so at the time, what I know of postmodernism now is basically from having dated somebody who was basically a postmodernist, though she would never admit it, nor would any postmodernist. And well, because then you're an ism, right? And postmodernists will reject all isms.
But how do you know if you're a postmodernist?
But so I had a scene where the riverboat is going in ever narrower circles. I was trying to play with this idea of different types of knowledge accumulation. And analytic school philosophers hate this idea of a hermeneutic circle because they call it mysticism. But anybody who's learned something like jiu-jitsu has experienced it.
Yeah.
So there is a certain value in a different type of rationality that is not purely logic-based. And that's where people like Peterson will get really irritated that postmodernists have destroyed reason itself, or they've attacked rationality itself, because they're bringing in, like, they question everything. They even question the idea of logic.
And isn't that, I mean, I guess from what I would gather from listening to him, he thinks that there has to be some sort of grounds for stability in order for people to, like, make their way through the world, right? So if you attack and destabilize everything, it's just like, what are you left with?
Yeah, and that's a move to bring back God. Because Peterson has also said you can't have morality without God. And that, to me, again, is absurd. If you look at, the only good Christian is a bad Christian, or the only good Muslim is a bad Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
If you actually start obeying all the rules in the Quran or the Bible,
Yeah.
you're stoning adulterers, you're killing people for.
Yeah, if you took it all literally, for sure. Yeah.
So
And
I just
so-
want to bring some, because you mentioned this, I want to bring something important here. I have had conversations with people here, like Canadians, that try to defend Islam in a way. Like they mention that there is nothing wrong in Quran and it's all people's interpretation. But then when I ask them about the specific verses, because I've read Quran because we were forced to do that in school, they almost 100% always, none of them had ever read the book. So they feel like they have, just by reading other people's interpretation of Quran, they have the knowledge. And that brings me to Peterson. Apparently he has said it himself that he's never read Derrida, right? And
Yeah.
he's read a criticism, a book. I think I sent you the name of the book before on Facebook, but he's read somebody else's criticism of Derrida. And that brings me to when I said part of my objection is that he's doing too much. I wanted to continue to say this. A lot of intellectuals like Sam Harris, they have time to read, and like in between the conversations, they go and do research. And I've heard oftentimes Sam goes, in the beginning of his podcast, he goes, that conversation I had 2 months ago, I've changed my mind about that, and here's what I read, and here's what I figured out. I don't feel like Peterson has the time to do that anymore, and that's
I don't
kind
feel like
of
he would change his mind very easily either.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
And to me, that's a good intellectual, somebody who's open, constantly open,
Yes.
and can be wrong.
But I'm gonna, in his defense though, like a lot of what he talks about comes from a psychology perspective. So he's really trying to ground people in like how to like get a grasp and like function, be a high functioning human being. And I think a lot of what he puts together is what he believes creates high functioning human beings from his clinical and psychological background, right? He's like, this is what I've seen. So he's, in a sense, maybe in a weird way, he's putting together like all the ideology, but it's like, this is, if you have these components in place, you're going to be psychologically stable and can like live a functional life.
And I think he's done a very good job of that.
Yeah.
I also think that, I really love his focus on responsibility. But I think, again, he could have gone a different way. Under Nietzsche, responsibility is the ability to respond. So you take charge of your life and you maintain the ability to respond. Victims, by definition, lose the ability to respond because they are victim. They are just, things are being done to them.
They have no power.
They have no power. And I agree with Peterson in how destructive victimhood culture is, not just for the people who are accused of being bullies, but first and foremost for the victims. And like, I think I see the Me Too movement and a lot of what's happening with respect to gender issues as conflating really serious stuff, like Weinstein and he was a really horrible person. They're conflating it with really minor, somebody hitting on somebody else or basic flirtation, where they're repeating the arguments that the Victorians made about all women, hysterical women who were too weak to handle complicated or dangerous ideas. The feminist, the fourth wave feminist left is acting exactly like 18th century Victorians who thought women couldn't be in school because they were too fragile.
Yeah.
So this idea of women suddenly being more fragile than men
It's like a step backwards.
is ridiculous,
Yeah.
and it's also fundamentally anti-female.
Yeah.
And
Yes. Yeah. I want to relate this back to. I've done like a lot of like personal development reading and training and that sort of thing like that. And in almost all of them, they talk about the idea of not letting yourself slide into a victim mentality because it's just so disempowering. Once you become a victim, it's just like you can't do anything anymore. So like they try to get at people's stories and be like, well, why are you telling yourself this story and you're using this as an excuse for a reason why you can't move forward in life, right? Yeah. And I think that's the perfect argument against why not to be a victim.
My grandfather survived the Holocaust. And he wasn't a victim afterwards.
Well, he
was a victim during it, but he didn't have the victim mindset. He went out and he didn't use it as an excuse. And because we're giving, in a sense, trying to correct the wrongs of history, we're giving power to victimhood. So we're creating incentive to be victims, and we're disempowering. It's like the aid programs in Africa did more damage than colonialism in a lot of ways because they created this dependency. And when I traveled through Africa, it was the countries that didn't get aid that were kind of coming out of there. They're progressing and they were growing and they were happy, and the countries that got the most aid were basket cases. And I honestly think that foreign aid did more damage to Africa than colonialism did,
right?
Because it created this dependency. And like you said, everything from the personal empowerment level to the national level to identity group level, victimhood culture is destructive for the very group it's trying to protect.
Right.
But we keep repeating it. And
Right. So, the good thing about all of this is that I feel like Peterson has like opened up this conversation completely.
Yeah.
Right. So it's just like now people can look at it in a way more nuanced perspective than they were before.
No, and I agree. And that's why I started everything with saying that I'm grateful for his contributions on the level of the conversation. I'm just a little worried that he's doing this in order to sneak in equally closed-minded ideas that are just happen to be out of favor right now,
right?
Through the religion and the traditionalism.
And I would just say, I think honestly, I do think he has good intentions. That I think that he does. You know what I mean? 100%. That would be my gut instinct from listening to a lot of him. And I feel like when let's say he is arguing for God or faith or something like that, I feel like I feel like again he's going to those like what are the building blocks within your life that you can use in order to like live a good life and be as highly functional as possible for you. And I feel like from his extensive experience, that's what he's trying to put together for people, right?
No, and I agree. And again, as a psychologist, he's done a lot of good. And maybe this is a problem with all psychologists. Like Richard Feynman, the physicist, once called psychology the cargo cult science. The cargo cult tribes, right? It was in I believe in Papua New Guinea. Whenever an aid plane landed, it delivered goods, and so the local tribes started worshipping the planes,
right.
and for their temples they would make fake runways, and they basically create a whole religion around airplanes because they were bringing these goodies from the sky. And so the idea is that psychology equates correlation with causation, and just psychology as a science is poor. It's a poor science, but it still does a lot of good for people.
Right.
And so I think that I agree with you that Peterson's doing a tremendous amount of good for a lot of people who need it, and a lot of people who felt disempowered, and a lot of people who felt locked out of the conversation because they didn't have the language to regain the power, given that the language of disempowerment has become so obsessed with identity groups.
Well, it took someone like of Peterson's caliber to be able to articulate it properly. Like, not many people, like I certainly couldn't have made the argument that he's made in the way that he's done it. You know what I mean? So I feel like a lot of people, there's all these, leftist ideas. It's like, I wouldn't know how to argue against those. You know what I mean? So it's like you needed somebody like him to come along and be like, hey, well, wait a second. What about this? What about this?
Well, I think to add to that, people criticize his book, 12 Rules for Life, that these rules are like common sense, but that's exactly about how you deliver the message, like sort yourself out and clean your room. Well, my dad told me that too, but many dads tell their kids, but that doesn't work. But the way Peterson kind of elaborates on that and tells you why you should clean your room, it actually works. So it's all about how you articulate your thoughts, and I think he's brilliant in that sense.
We had a pause, so we're back now. We had to pay some parking meters and use the facilities, but we want to jump right back into the conversation over to Alexander Boldizar right now.
Oh, well, just during the pause, you were talking about the issue of the pendulum swinging when we were talking about the social justice left, that a lot of the justifications are that, you know, X category has been oppressive, and so now it's time for some unfairness in the other direction to balance out historical injustice. And I just want to say that's been the argument used by in nearly every human atrocity in history, whether it's the Hutu, no, the Jews claiming, Nazis claiming that the Jews controlled the banking system and had too much power, and so that's why they were justifying the Holocaust, to the Tutsi saying that the Hutus, sorry, I may have gotten backwards. The Rwandan genocide, basically 1/3 of the population had been in charge for a long time, and I believe it was the Tutsis had been in power, and the Hutus basically took genocide to balance out the historical injustice. To, you know, the Serbians felt wronged by oppression under the Ottoman Empire, so that's why they felt they were justified in massacring Bosnians. It's a very, very dangerous mindset to create these categories of people that can be shut up. Like we were talking about, you know, well, you must be a man, so that's why the ad hominem attack. Yeah. When the ad hominem is based in a category, in an identity, that's how we've gotten into so much trouble historically. Like, well, you can't judge people as categories, especially when there's a resentment involved. Like, historical resentment plus categories tends to lead to really horrible things happening.
And it's a technique. Sorry, what's up?
I want to just jump in on this because this, I think, an opportunity to ask a question about this kind of stuff. And for example, let's say somebody who's in the social justice realm and they're advocating for Indigenous, like, you know, let's take the First Nations of Canada. Now, so they've been oppressed, they've had their land taken away in, you know, unceded ways apparently, and all this kind of stuff. So yes, so now it's like, now they're severely disadvantaged in terms of, like, you know, an economical standpoint, from which, you know, now land has value and they lost all their land, all that kind of stuff. So, like, so historically, like, yeah, we don't want to create this narrative like, well, now you got to pay for, you know, the pendulum to swing the other way. So, like, what do you, for that sort of scenario, it's like, well, what do you say to that? Like, how do you counter, or not necessarily counter it, but, like, I don't know. I mean, do you just kind of say, like, well, you know, atrocities have happened throughout human history, and that was just a very recent one, and you know, go to the root of, you know, developing each person and helping them to become more abled in the future, and hopefully their next generation. Like, what do you, like, how do you address that, or do you ever think about that?
I do. My grandmother, the city she was born in, was in 5 different countries during her lifetime. So, you know, land is not something essentialized. I mean, it has to be libertarian right that prizes property above all else. So atrocities do happen, and there's a risk of sounding cold-hearted about it. That's not what I mean to do. My view would be focus, well, two parts. One, focus on the individual. If that person was wronged, then that person should get reparations or justice. But I don't believe in racial guilt, and I don't believe in racial advantage. But of those two, I think the guilt idea is much more dangerous. So if you're going to talk about a disenfranchised or disempowered minority, or first of all, focus on present injustice. You know, if the First Nations person is twice as likely to have a cop called on them because they're sitting in a, you know, in a rich neighborhood, than a white person, focus on that and fix that and make sure that doesn't happen, rather than focusing on history that doesn't have to do with that individual. And second, focus on the injustice, not on blaming the other side. So if you're going to talk about, say, in the U.S. or here as well, you talk about, you know, African Americans are much more likely to be stopped by the cops. don't label it white privilege. Label it a screwed up system with respect to police interaction and profiling and all that. But once you start talking about white privilege, you're turning negative. You're blaming a group for something else, and you're going to create a backlash. You're going to create, look at what the deplorables did. Yeah, calling the deplorables help Trump. It doesn't help the people you're trying to help. It ends up having a backlash. And it's frustrating to me how poor liberals are at tactics and strategy. And you attack a group, and then you wonder why there's white identity politics suddenly. If you're talking about white privilege, and then, where does that, crazy right-wing white identity politics come from? Well, you created that identity by labeling them as a negative. So focus on the group you're trying to help, not blaming a whole giant group with white privilege when you have homeless, like, again, past the homeless white guy. He's not privileged. The people I went to Harvard Law School with, those are privileged, and they were of all races. So focus on who's being hurt, not who's not being hurt enough.
But also sometimes subjects are more complex than they try to make it like so black and white. Sure. Like the African American situation that you bring up in the US. I'm subscribed to a YouTube channel, Police Activity. They put up police incidents that have gone to the court, so they release the camera footage from the police, and it's like from what you can see, like that's the evidence. It's like 80% of it is justified. Like you see the shootings that have caused riots in like cities from the black community, that when the footage was released 2 months after the court was done, you see that was actually justified. So sometimes it is like a certain police department in a city could be like have racist elements to it or racist people operating in it, but there are times that it's actually there's more to the story than that. So basically what I'm saying is it's not so black and white all the time. So
I wanted to come back to the idea of the pendulum swinging and how that's sort of been used by people in power to create, like, say, the other in order to justify going and killing the Jews or taking over a country or whatever, right? And this is probably a good segue into tribalism and how that works. So, can you maybe speak about maybe why are humans so tribalistic in our nature?
Well, we evolved that way, right? We evolved in groups of 150 to 200, protecting each other, and we selected for genes that were cooperative within our tribe and competitive outside the tribe. We have several 100,000 years or a couple million years of evolution. I mean, primates work in tribes too. The problem is that's a very simplistic information processing mechanism for a very different world, but because it's literally encoded in our DNA to be tribal through the law of selective pressures, it's something we always have to watch out for. And the minute you open the door for tribalism, it's going to explode because of
we're predisposed to be acting that way.
Yeah. It's like, children of alcoholics may be predisposed to alcoholism. We're predisposed to be tribal. Everyone's predisposed to be tribal.
Yeah.
And you can't pick and choose your tribalism. You can't be tribal up to a point and say, okay, only these groups get to be tribal and the rest don't.
Right.
Because the minute you open the door, the minute you make it socially acceptable to draw a circle around 1 million people, you're going to create injustice. And you're going to get all the other people to get it tribal as well. And particularly if you're creating a group of circle around in a negative sense, like white privilege. The minute you create an offensive, in the sense of attacking group, or say all Muslims are terrorists or whatever, any kind of circle like that around a large group of people is going to create an incredible amount of pushback. And not seeing that, to me, it seems self-evident that you used to be called racism and sexism. It used to be a bad thing. And it's weird now that the people who were the most vulnerable to it are trying to recreate those structures. They're recreating the same colonial arguments or racist arguments, or they're perceiving the role in the exact same paradigms, just swapping who's got which role.
And I think what they're doing is it's an effort to protect people who they believe are marginalized.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
But again, when the Hutus attacked the Tutsis, they were doing the same thing. It never works out well. I'm not saying the reasons behind it are nefarious. They're very positive. They're trying to help. But I think that the long-term consequences are always negative.
Well, like again, the backlash. Like you're going to get that.
Well, backlash, but also it's fundamentally unjust to judge you for what I've done.
Right.
Just because we have the same pigment.
Yeah.
Like if you're punished because of what I'm doing, that breaks against the entire Western tradition of justice and law and due process. It gets back to the earliest kind of, I'll wipe out your whole village because you insulted me kind of mindset.
Right. And that's the big problem with the group identity stuff. Like group identity, and that's a big part of Peterson's argument as well. Like why we shouldn't do that.
Yeah. And I think all collectives are dangerous. I mean, I part with the right because I think corporations are also a collective. But I think all collective identities are, a group has no soul. By soul, I mean like responsibility, ability to make decisions and consequences of your own decisions. When you start punishing, when you start lumping people, analyzing them as groups, you're turning them into objects. You're not seeing them.
You're making the other, right?
You're making the other. That's the definition of creating another.
Yeah.
And all these left-wing thinkers in the 70s did a lot, in 60s and 70s did a lot of good in showing how dangerous it is to create the other. And now the inheritors of that political tradition are doing the exact same thing against the other. And it seems, again, short-sighted.
So we talked about like the group. The group is, again, to create a group identity, to create the other, or to serve the members within the group, so that group can do better, right? So
it's a power move. We've created a situation where we allocate power based on group membership, and so it's natural to start for people to seek power in that sense.
So my question is then, like, is it possible to exist as human beings in the way we are without that?
Is it possible? Yes.
Because there's always another country. There's always another class, like an economic class. There's always the other, and there's always these struggles, right? So it's like.
Well, it comes back to Derrida's thing. If you can't define a house without a shed and a mansion in between on either side, so yes, there's always a pressure towards creating distinctions. But if we keep reminding ourselves that the relevant characteristics are not the stupid ones, like skin color or which set of genitals you have. Yeah. Those are stupid distinctions.
Yeah.
We used to have those distinctions about hair color. Gingers were considered tainted by the devil, and anybody with red hair.
Now they're considered just like freaky.
Yeah.
And bad. Yeah.
And you didn't get rid of discrimination against redheads by creating redhead pride days and stuff. You did it by showing how absurd it is to judge people by their hair color.
Right. And
so now we need to do that with every superficial skin deep category.
But judging by culture, though, what do you think of that?
There's more validity, perhaps, but even then, you don't know how much somebody has internalized their own culture.
Right.
Yeah.
So just because somebody comes from a particular culture doesn't mean that they share the values. You come from Iran.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that you're a Muslim extremist. You're an atheist, right?
Right.
So if I judged you by Iranian culture, I would be wrong.
Right.
And so the cost of group categories is being wrong.
So how about those moments in life that like sometimes we have short-term interactions with people that we have to be really quick at judging in moments. So one of the examples one of my friends was giving me was you're walking in Granville Street at 1 a.m., right? And then you see on your left a metalhead, like someone with black shirt and like tons of tattoos, and he's drunk. And on the other hand, there is like a smaller person with like tie and like completely suited up and everything, and he's also drunk. But which way? Like you're in the middle of the street, you have to go to either side to walk as a pedestrian. You have to judge in that moment. Like you might get in trouble if you go towards one of them.
Yeah, well, you've loaded the question by saying you have to judge. You have to think quick. You've read Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, or you're familiar with the idea of fast thinking versus slow thinking, right?
A little bit, yeah.
So fast thinking is this instinctive, primal gut reaction of am I afraid of the metalhead or the suit, but if you have to, then you have to think fast.
Yeah.
But there are lots of opportunities in life where you have a choice. Like I know that my first impressions are usually wrong, and I make a conscious decision to avoid letting them, like giving them too much value. In contrast, our society tends to, or Hollywood tends to feed, you trust your gut, trust your first impressions. Your first impressions are usually pretty stupid because they're made up of all your biases and preconceptions and all the garbage that our lizard brain is kicking out. So when you have the opportunity of choosing between thinking fast and slow, prioritize the results of slow thinking and actually analyzing it. And that's a practice that you can get into where just being aware that your first impressions are often wrong. And I'm a big believer in Bayesian rationality. Bayesian rationality is probabilistic. You start off with whatever information you have, and you gotta make decisions on what you have, but you keep getting new information as you're interacting with somebody. And so keep updating your mental image and your probabilities.
Right.
It's almost never gonna be zero, and it's almost never gonna be 1. Like, you're not going to be convinced. It's a whole gray scale of thinking where you adjust based on every moment.
Right.
You're adjusting your decision of what the correct outcome is. So you come into your scenario, there's a suit and a metalhead. Initially, you have very little information. You're going to angle towards the suit.
Right.
But then the way they're moving, their body language, maybe the suit moves like a fighter. Maybe he's got his hands in his pocket like he's hiding a knife. Instead of relying on that first impression, you keep updating your model as you're walking towards it. Take a deeper look and keep updating as you're walking closer and closer, and as you're realizing that the suit is actually
an MMA fighter.
Maybe I'll head towards the metalhead.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, you're never going to be 100% sure that who's going to jump you until one of them jumps you.
Right.
But you do have the opportunity to keep updating. And
I took a critical thinking class. They taught us exactly that.
Yeah.
It's all about probabilities.
It's all about probabilities.
And updating the
And once you start thinking of truth in terms of probabilities, you're less likely to get caught up in this ideological possession. You're much less likely to get tribal in your identities of people because you're not looking for truth.
And you're leaving
you're leaving room for being wrong. I think doubt is the most valuable thing. Maybe, again, our society teaches be confident. Like, there's a place for confidence in terms of external perceptions, but internally, you should be always doubting yourself because it's the only way you leave open room for updated information.
Yeah.
Right.
Awesome.
I want to switch. I don't know how we're doing for time. I assume we're just gonna keep going.
Yeah, we got about
5 minutes.
Yeah, 5 to 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, because I wanted to really touch on like inequality, especially like income or wealth inequality, right? And there's this book called The Great Leveler, where they talk about how wealth inequality has always existed, and it's a huge problem because if there's too much inequity with resources, eventually there's going to be a group that just says, well, screw this, and they flip the game board over and they just want to start from scratch. And there's really no good way. In the book, they also talk about how despite whatever sort of philosophical, religion, political system has been in play, inequality has always come up. And like wealth inequality in particular has always become like a 1% or even greater than that. So, how do we address that situation? Or how do you think we can address? Because, well, according to Peterson, he says we don't know how to address that situation properly yet, where it's like there's always going to be that massive gap and it causes huge problems.
Well, there's always going to be a tension, but there are ways you can aim towards optimizing it. I'm with Peterson in terms of, I think equality of opportunity is important. Equality of outcome is dangerous. but I think he would disagree with some of the ways of, if you actually pushed him, equality of opportunity would mean, for example, much higher estate tax. Like, you have people who inherit $1 billion. Trump started with 400 million. Is Trump really that capable if you're starting off with 400 million that you inherited? Now, if you create much greater estate tax, you're going to move towards equality of opportunity. Healthcare is a huge leveler of equality of opportunity. A lot of people in the U.S. They get stuck in crazy debt, huge debt. Universities, you make universities free, you're creating more equality of opportunity.
He's all for that, by the way.
Oh, he is, okay. Because a lot of right-wingers claim they want equality of opportunity, but then when it comes to healthcare and education and daycare for the kids so the parents can work, like, it's amazing. I was a single dad. I couldn't work in an office. I had to work from home because I had to pick up my son at 3 o'clock, and the hours, they're not friendly towards working parents.
So you think the potential solution to that could be like trying to create more equality of opportunity?
Yes. Yeah. And I think maximize. If you are brilliant, you should never have to pay for university. We need to give more back to the people who can do the most,
right?
And support them. And
how do you select those people? IQ testing, like, is you just basically through high schools and be like, okay, you're above 140, so you automatically go for free?
IQ testing is not enough because IQ doesn't count as much as the hard work that you're willing to put into it. It's a combination. It's always been a combination of factors, and so basically, you just whatever the test is, capable people will end up learning how to beat the test. So whatever the education criteria is, as long as there is some kind of filtering mechanism, the top will tend to get in if there are rewards. But if they can't afford to go to university, then you're losing very potentially qualified people who will change society. You're losing the Bill Gates and the Einsteins and people like that. There's a basic level of humanity that I think we need to maintain, which goes towards more equality of outcome. Like, you don't want people starving on the street. Right. So it's not a black and white 100% all or nothing. But if you prioritize, like Peterson talks about, if you prioritize equality of outcome, you basically suffocate society. You suffocate all the
right, because now you're really limiting maybe from the best rising to the top.
Yeah,
and that's what Trudeau did with his cabinet. Was it 50% women just because there were women? Is that the type of
right?
That was like his first action as prime minister, I believe.
Right.
Yeah, and he's still like, Trudeau looks like he's doing his absolute. I never voted for the guy. He's doing his best he can to make sure we get Trump here. Like, even the trade delegations. I don't think any country in the world has ever had trade delegations that support trade only with certain identity groups within their country. Whereas Trudeau has created trade delegations that will only support, promote LGBTQ businesses abroad, or Aboriginal businesses, or women's businesses. He's basically balkanizing what has been always a function of support Canadian business in the U.S. and Europe, wherever. And instead of just going forth and saying, hey, do more business in Canada, he's decided to create tiny little groups and support these types of businesses, that type of business. And then, look, Canada's largest province, Ontario, or most populous province, just elected a Trump analog. And it's no wonder.
So it seems like the more you push on the left, you kind of gravitate people who are on moderate right to go towards more radical right.
Well, my view is that right now the extreme left and right are the alt-right and the control left, the keys. The alt-right and the control left are feeding off each other and sucking all the air out of the middle. And there are still a lot of people in the middle, but they're being pulled towards, because again, it's
polarizing.
It's polarizing, and we've combined it with this black and white view of it's our team or you're the devil. We've really put on sports jerseys, and Canada was much better about that than the U.S. U.S. was, it's only about 5% that goes between Democrats and Republicans. It's much more about turnout. But Canada, that's a fairly recent phenomenon where we're turning into much more entrenched left and right, and it's
so more tribal.
More tribal, yeah.
So then, all right, we don't have a lot of time, but what would be the Boldizarian solution to this?
Not throw boulders at each other. I don't know.
If you can't lift it, you're out. Sorry. Can't play.
Yeah, that's a very small circle of people, though.
No, I'm a big believer in meritocracy, and leaving space open and protecting the space for disagreement and having conversations, like having friends that are drastically different from you in every which way, like true diversity. You know, have people from different backgrounds, different political ideas, and don't treat them as the enemy, but as an opportunity to get out. We're turning into such bubbles. I think the more you engage with people who are different, the more you protect that space through things like, you know, free speech.
Yeah.
And free speech, this is one thing I want to touch on. People, especially in America, they tend to equate free speech with the First Amendment. Free speech is not coterminous with the First Amendment. It's not, okay, in terms of law in the US, it's only government speech. But if you look back on free speech, back to Voltaire fighting against the church, there's a value in just having a huge diversity of ideas. And so it's not just, oh, this isn't government speech, so it's not protected. On a cultural level, we need to protect the idea of offensive ideas clashing against each other and weeding out each other's weaknesses. Mm-hmm. You don't grow, you don't change. The left used to want change, but now they don't want change. They want to entrench everything. It's like the policeman's mindset that they would pour concrete on a flower to preserve the flower forever. That's what the left seems to be doing with what the gains it's won. Mm-hmm. You have to protect that open air and allow for offensive ideas to beat each other up until the weakness of each one is winnowed out, and that's how you get change. That's how you get progress.
And maybe like at the individual level, not taking it so personally if you're wrong.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like, it's okay if you get proven wrong. I mean, it's fine. I think people get so defensive when they might be proven wrong that they'll just polarize them further and they'll get further entrenched. Where it's like, you know, it's okay to admit that you've made a mistake. And I think that's.
I had the best example of this. I had a Facebook argument when Trump was elected with a First Nations guy in Canada who was a huge Trump supporter, and he was MMA guy. He was actually battlefield fight champion. He would go into the ring and get punched in the face. He used to come and train a little bit at North Van. He had no problem being choked unconscious, being punched in the face. He would stay friends with people who punched him in the face. He came on my Facebook page and said he loves Trump because Trump says it the way it is. And so we argued back and forth a little bit, and by the end he defriended me, even though I knew him in real life. He defriended me and blocked me. And I found it so odd that a guy who's willing to take punches to the face is not willing to take a few pointy words, and will end a friendship that well, we weren't exactly friends, we were good acquaintances in real life. And the words were somehow harder for him to take.
Doesn't he know the nursery rhyme, sticks and stones will break my bones,
Yeah.
but words will never hurt me?
But this came from the right, so it's not just the left-wing phenomenon to be the snowflake phenomenon. It's on both sides.
Yeah.
It really, people have gotten to the point where I think schools have spent so much time validating emotions instead of teaching good rhetorical skills and the idea of keeping ideas on the level of ideas. That's my solution. Proper classical education, bringing back things like rhetoric and argument and debate.
All right. Excellent. Well, I think we can end it there because we basically solved the problem. So,
No, I agree. No, we'll definitely wrap it up. But yeah, that was super interesting. I mean, I'm gonna have to go back and re-listen to this one, and which I've done with other podcasts with you on it because it's hard to absorb it all. But I know, but you do a really good job of formulating what you're trying to say with examples, and I always understand them better when I re-listen to them. Like the first run through, it's a lot to take in.
It is,
and then
yeah.
but when I let myself have the space to go back to it, you do a really good job. So that's why I'm excited to go back and listen to this one, because you do a really good job of just articulating and bringing together your ideas and whatever that is. So
I'm glad to hear it, because especially the postmodernist stuff, it's really tricky because they avoid definitions as part of their approach. So trying to package it
So
Yeah,
and well, you have to package it to understand
Yeah.
it, right? And that's the whole thing. It's the confusion part about it. But yeah, thank you very much for coming on.
Oh, it's fun as always.
Every time you come on, it's they're always some of my favorite episodes. Like honestly, so
I love the conversations. It's
yeah.
It's
Well,
fun.
it's great because we have when the anarchist lawyer comes on, I love that non-black and white thinking, the grayscale thinking, and I do think you look at it from like a very from the most honest perspective that you think is going to actually help people, right, and make things potentially a bit better. So,
Hope so.
yeah.
And Omid, thank you for
Yeah, no
coming in
problem.
as well and being a part of
That's
this.
fine.
You kind of
Well,
prompted
you
this
were
whole thing,
this is
so-
your whole idea. This whole podcast is your idea.
It's been a kind of a dream to make this happen, to have conversation with Boldizar for what, 6 months?
Yeah.
I was hoping
Yeah.
that you would get more from you about the black and white thinking, because I know that was a big issue that
Yeah.
for you, kind of fighting against black and white
Well,
thinking.
one thing about me is that I'm pretty honest in front of you guys and in front of the audience. I'm not the most articulate person due to the fact that I learned English by listening mostly to TV shows, South Park to be specific, and a lot of debates that Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens. So I've been listening and learning English, and it's only in the past 5 years that I've been speaking. So I'm not really that confident when it comes to articulating my ideas. So I kind of, I don't know. I'm not shy, but I wouldn't do my ideas justice if I wanted to
Articulate them.
articulate. And that's why I got into video production. So
You can express yourself through that. Yeah.
and that's what is coming next. Hopefully, after these couple projects I'm doing,
Cool.
trying to save enough money to either make a film or a documentary. And
Awesome. Well,
Yeah,
we'll
I'm
definitely
working on
keep the folks who listen to us informed on that too. And
Yeah.
go check out Omega Point. There's still amazing videos on there as well. So
and
you know,
also Boldizar's The Ugly on
Yes.
Amazon.
The
Yeah.
ugly. Yeah.
yeah, you have the ugly.
Boldizar.com.
the Czech translation is coming out next month.
That's awesome.
And they're flying me out to the Colors of Ostrava
What?
festival,
That's so cool.
which is a huge music festival. It's got Grace Jones, Ziggy Marley, all these like big names, and then
And then
I'm going to be sitting
Boldizar.
there with my little Oshklivetsted. translation of the
Well,
ugly.
congratulations on that. That's really cool.
fun. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, so that's the Ugly novel. You can get that. You can buy it on Amazon.
Amazon chapters.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
So pick that up if you enjoyed listening to what Boldizar has to say, and you want to support an author and also have a very entertaining and deep story. Go check out the Ugly novel by Alexander Boldizar. And other than that,
Well, if you want to float,
use
the promo code Vancouver Real for a 20% discount on a single float.
And
And I
until
think we
next
can
time,
wrap it up to whatever
I've been
is.
craving that magnesium.
And you
Yeah,
need the magnesium.
to whatever is.